On this edition of Geopolitics and Empire, we have a really interesting guest, Dr. Piers Robinson. He is the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, former chair in politics at the University of Sheffield, and he founded the working group on Syria, propaganda, and media. He's been at the forefront, together with other experts such as Tim Hayward and Vanessa Beeley, in blowing apart the Western media narrative in the war on Syria, poking holes in the White Helmets story and the corruption within the OPCW and their fabrication of chemical attacks in Syria. We'll be discussing that and the current pandemonium surrounding the coronavirus situation, of which he recently wrote about, and he questions whether we're witnessing another deep event, such as the September 11th attacks, and if corona is the new global 9/11. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I've been following you for years, and you recently wrote a really good piece for Off Guardian that looks at how governments use events such as 9/11 and COVID-19, what's happening now, to bring about, to push forward this national security state, militarize society, introduce draconian laws, install a mass total surveillance state. I'm here in Kazakhstan right now, and we're not, in a few days, we're not going to be allowed to leave the house, and we'll be given cards that will permit us every other day to leave the house. I'm just reading in Australia now, they're going to fine people $11,000 or jail time for leaving their house without an excuse. So this is now happening around the world, especially and including in the West, not just China. And so, getting to your article, for many of us, the official 9/11 story doesn't add up. And you mentioned recent publications from the University of Alaska and elsewhere, which confirmed that the official U.S. government investigation was wrong, if not plain fraudulent. You write that the 9/11 global war on terror is increasingly coming to be understood across the world as a remarkable propaganda campaign designed to enable violent conflict in the international system, and with its effects and objectives being far wider and deeper than had been suggested by official narratives regarding the need to combat Al-Qaeda. So then you ask, is the coronavirus a new 9/11, a new deep event? And you say that the parallels with what is happening today are obvious. And I think this is the question on all of our minds, and the markers are pointing to this. So can you help us kind of understand what you mean by deep event and what is happening as you see it?
Well, I mean, there are the idea of deep events. This was, I think, Peter Dale Scott who coined that phrase. But the idea of very significant events which occur, which are then used and exploited in order to push through really fundamental long-term changes, economic, social, political, etc. And I mean, obviously, the point when I wrote the article was to really flag up the point that we know, a lot of us know a lot about 9/11 and know a lot about the questions and uncertainties. And certainly from a strictly academic point of view, it's an instant, it's a case, it's an event which is very poorly understood. And at the same time, there are very powerful, legitimate questions, which some academics do look at, which raise serious questions about who was behind the event and so on. And those debates have actually been going on for a long time, and they have actually more recently started to come to the surface a little bit more, particularly with a big university study at the University of Alaska, which raised very serious doubts about the official investigation into the collapse of WTC-7 in New York, and also a range of other academics who have over the years been raising questions, etc. And it's very clear that event, on the one hand, there's a lot of questions about the manipulation and the involvement of various groups in that event. And also, perhaps more importantly than that, is the way in which that event was used politically. And in a sense, whilst there is sort of this kind of emerging academic debate about what actually happened on 9/11, there's a lot less dispute that this event was definitely used and exploited, principally in terms of my own research area, to enable the regime change conflicts, which we've seen actually now over 20 years. 9/11 became a deep event which ushered in civil liberty restrictions, etc., but also a war on terror, which has And I think the empirical record is pretty clear now, and pretty convincing that it was used to initiate wars, to remove countries from the international system, which were seen as challengers, opponents to the United States and to the West. And so obviously, this is just in the last 20 years, and these wars are still going on. We're still in the situation where the wars which flowed out of 9/11 are still in play, Syria, for example, and also coming wars, potentially Iran, China, possibly, and so on. So when you put all those sort of blocks into place, it becomes quite clear that you've had a major, in a sense, propaganda, this war on terror, this hysteria over Islamic fundamentalist terrorism being used to start major wars in the international system, which are still going on and which might get worse at some point. You have that kind of exploitation and propaganda going on in relation to that. The obvious question when you have this incredible event with the coronavirus suddenly breaking out into the newspapers and mobilizing governments around the world in the same way that 9/11 mobilized governments, particularly in the West. The really important questions to ask is that how is this event going to be exploited? Is it going to become a deep deep event which is exploited by countries in order to pursue particular objectives? And of course, the great danger we have is that, and I remember, I'll sort of finish on this train in a second, when 9/11 occurred, very few people in the West could really say anything. Everyone was caught in the headlights, and the war in Afghanistan very quickly initiated, and then the regime change wars started to flow after that. There's very little resistance because people were terrified. Terrified by the threat of terrorism. We know that threat was overblown at the very least, and also obviously serious questions about who was actually involved with 9/11 and so on. And when you have those climates of fear, which is what we have now, the danger for exploitation is absolutely huge. And it is critical at this point that people start to think on that level. If we're all going to be caught in the headlines having a blind panic about viruses, etc., then we're in a very, very dangerous position. And I think we are in a very dangerous position. And every day that passes reinforces to me, and the more information I get from my work and what other people are passing to me, says the same thing, that we should be very, very concerned about what's going on, that there is every sign that this is going to be a deep event. And it's going to be used. It might be used to take us to war. It might be used for fundamental restructuring of the economy, and so on, a whole host of things, most of them linked, I think, to the attempts by Western governments, Western elites, establishment to maintain their power in the international system. But I think those threats are very, very real. And they certainly, in my opinion, they transcend the immediate threats of a virus, which is a low lethality virus. It is. We know the categories of people that it's most dangerous for, but at the moment, there's no indication that it's significantly different from what we see with major flu outbreaks every year across the West. It's quite amazing what's happening, I have to admit. But I mean, all the alarm bells are ringing on this, I would say, that this is, we're in great danger of very dark deeds being enacted in the coming months and years off the back of the coronavirus crisis.
Before taking a look at some of these potential dark deeds, you mentioned the fear and hysteria, which we saw with 9/11, and we're seeing again now this fear and hysteria with the virus. And I think maybe right now, maybe a few more people are questioning what's going on than they were during 9/11. But it still seems to me that 99% of the people that I know around me have been taken in by this fear and hysteria of the virus. And I think most people don't have a really good understanding of history, political science, and the reality of deep events. And they've suffered from years of institutional propaganda and brainwashing, and they don't question anything they're being told. We see government, media, institutions, and scientists lie. And if you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeing now with this propaganda aspect and the narrative control on COVID, because as you said, there are many real experts and scientists who are questioning the official mortality rate and um, other things. So, I mean, what's your take on, because we're like witnessing 9/11 again, and we're in real time, you can kind of look at the propaganda that's happening. So what's your thought there?
Well, I mean, we certainly, there certainly seems to be questioning going on. I mean, I think everyone's caught in this situation at the moment. There are signs that there are some serious questions being asked. You know, in the UK context, you had Lord Suntian raising these issues, and Peter Hitchens, and you've seen some other journalists in the UK mainstream media raising questions about civil liberties, raising questions about the context for the death figures which are being given, and saying, well, there's no context for these. This doesn't really help people understand how serious this is. So I think that there is some question, but it is coming up against a really very thoroughgoing, what I've described as sort of propagandistic information, which is pouring through the mainstream media. I mean, I think there's a lot of, as has been pointed out by other people, there's been a lot of fear-mongering. A lot of the coverage of this issue, and certainly some of the mainstream coverage which I've taken the time to look at, you would be forgiven for thinking that we were dealing with something that was similar to the bubonic plague from the 16th, 17th century. The kind of understanding that's being communicated is one that simply generates hysteria, or generates, if not hysteria, at least people have great difficulty thinking rationally about, well, are these measures the government is putting in place, are they appropriate? What is the risk of in a sense, making the situation far worse through sort of economic crisis and so on? People are having great difficulty, I think, thinking straight. With the mass of, the kind of reaction you're getting from the mainstream media. I think there's something to keep in mind is if terrorism and the fear of terrorism is a powerful, as it were, propaganda tool, potentially, making people fearful of, in the case of 9/11, fearful of Muslim fundamentalist terrorists. I mean, the potential is something like the virus, or a virus propaganda tool, if it's being used for those purposes, is that this is all-encompassing. People are made scared of everybody else. Everybody is scared of everybody because of the virus. And of course, it taps into these sort of, culturally, this deep-rooted fear of contagion and disease and so on, which we grow up with. There's stories from history and so on. People are easily terrified, and I think in this situation, propaganda is, it's acutely powerful, in the sense that people, are obsessively looking at the death tolls going up and up, without any context being given for those death tolls. And as some people have pointed out, well, this looks like, comparable to a couple of years ago when we had a big flu outbreak and so on. There's very little proportion in the way it's being discussed, certainly in the mainstream media. And that is fueling this kind of this almost this juggernaut, or this propaganda juggernaut at the moment. And it's very difficult for people to raise questions. Although, as you said, there are people raising questions, and I have some hope that certainly in the UK context, possibly the European context, is that there will start to be a rational debate over the response that there should be to this virus, and a careful check on power and what governments might be doing. I think it's going to be a bit of a battle to achieve that, but I do think there's hope for doing that. There does seem to be some movement and some doubt. And I would say that everything we have that we can pull together in terms of the lethality and the dangers of this virus. I mean, there is so much hype around it. There's so much fear that people think this is almost as bad as a bubonic plague, when in reality it's not. That this could be a propaganda bubble which is very fragile, which could burst. When people sit back and think, well, is it really the case that some of the worst case scenario death tolls will actually be realized, and that's not the case, that people start to think, and they see people saying, well, look, this is not entirely different from a year ago when we had the flu outbreak, and there are better ways of trying to manage this problem other than clamping down in the way that they are on civil liberties. There's potential for all of that, I think, for a more intelligent discussion to occur, but I think it's going to be a battle to get that, but it's essential to get that. Otherwise, we just run the risk of what we had after 9/11. We just ran headlong into war after war after war, which carry on until this day, which caused huge amounts of destruction. And also loss of civil liberties, the Patriot Act, the acceptance of bulk surveillance by intelligence services. This is totally incompatible with democracy. You can't have a democracy where people know that they're being monitored potentially by these intelligence services, and yet 9/11 was used to bring that in. So I think there's some debate, and people who do understand what's going on need to push very hard at this point in time to talk sense. And to try to get people to think rationally and to hold their governments to account. Okay, and fingers crossed on that.
So in a way, as you mentioned, coronavirus has become the new Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and it gives kind of governments carte blanche now to do what they want. And as Peter Hitchens and Lord Assumption have wrote. In a way, people are voluntarily being duped into giving up their freedoms. And it's a classical historical example of how democracies turn into dictatorships. And so there's this question, which should we fear more, COVID-19 or what I like to call COVID 1984, right? You mentioned mass surveillance. So now it seems what's already being implemented, laws are being passed in countries around the world. Israel passed this law that gives them now the ability to surveil every Israeli citizen's mobile phone. That same law then was passed in one of my countries. I'm also a Croatian citizen. Croatia just passed that same law that was passed in Israel to give the government full access to our mobile devices to spy on us. And so, how far can things go? We had the Patriot Act. As a U.S. citizen now, because of the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, I can be, on my next trip to the U.S., I can be apprehended by authorities and they can say, we think you're a terrorist, but we don't have any evidence, but we can keep you in prison indefinitely. And so that's where we were with 9/11. And so how far from what you're seeing can things go now?
I think at the moment, I think things are getting close to as bad as they could possibly be. I think that, as I said in the article, it might be the case that this virus is as serious as some have suggested, and that the lockdown is necessary, and it will bring it to an end, and then everything will go back to normal. That might well happen, and I'll be relieved if that's the case. But it doesn't really look like that to me. I think that the losses of civil liberties and freedoms, which are being justified because of the virus, some of that will be clawed back when the emergency state is lifted, but not all of it. That this will be used to essentially to further close down democracy in the West. And so I think it's as bad as it could be. I think there are very worrying signs that in the context of a hybrid warfare against China and other competitors in the international system, the Western power blocs will use this crisis to further hybrid war. I suspect, although I can't be sure, I suspect this is going on as we speak. There's indications in Iran, Iraq, etc., and Syria of potential military activity. There's been some, doubling down on the propaganda against China. This has got all the signs of the hybrid war escalating further. And I guess, one isn't speculating saying that. We've been in a war for 20 years. Some would argue much longer than that, but certainly the current phase of conflict in the international system was 9/11 triggered. And so we've been in that state of war in many theaters for 20 years. And so why is that suddenly going to come to an end now? There's no reason to think that it will. I think in broader geopolitical terms, the West and America is in a position where it's weakening in the international system. And competitors such as China are rising up. And as I'm sure you know, as many realist theorists would point out, that when you have those transitions in the balance of power, they're often accompanied by conflict, sometimes major conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing, and that's what we're observing. It's difficult to be absolutely sure, because obviously we see lots of governments reacting to corona in particular ways, but I'm sort of in a sense more concerned about how our governments in the West are reacting to it and what they might be using it for. And it's undoubtedly the case that we know the West has been pushing a belligerent warfare strategy for 20 years. It's clear as day, that's been going on. So there is no reason to think that's going to stop. It's probably going to be extended now. And we have to be very worried about that, just as much as we have to be worried about whatever kind of restructuring of the economy that they might try and push through under the cover of corona. That's not so much my area of expertise, but war and conflict is. And I'm very concerned about that. This is a very worrying moment, I think. And I don't know where it's going to go. But what I do know, it's more likely to go to bad places if everyone is so panicked by coronavirus that they don't have time to look at what's going on. So,
you mentioned China, and it was startling to a few days ago to read now in Western military publications. You have former. I read an article about the Dragon. I can't remember the title, but basically about China now thinking about attacking the U.S. In the Pacific or elsewhere. Launching a direct attack against the U.S. So the fact that some in the West are already discussing military conflict with China. So we're starting to see these articles pop up. And I mean, do you think it's a realistic scenario going forward? As you said, why will they stop this military expansion now? We have the Thucydides trap where, we're kind of in this formula that kind of plays itself out, unfortunately. Is it realistic that we might see China and the US, go from hybrid to real military conflict in your mind?
Well, in a way, I suspect that it's. I mean, hybrid warfare is real military war. I think. If you look at the conflict that's occurred in Syria, and that's army of proxy groups and so on, and the kind of activities that you saw throughout the noughties before the war really started in a big way in 2011. All of these tactics which are used to try and weaken and break society, sanctions, for example, it's all part of hybrid warfare. I mean, this is war. It's not sort of tanks and aircraft and so on. So I don't think we should ever downplay, how important hybrid warfare is and how destructive potentially. I think in this context, I think there is a possibility of all-out military conflict, but I think that's less likely. I think it's going to be a hybrid warfare intensification of that. Now, I think it's difficult. I mean, could the West seriously win a military engagement with China? Probably not. So that's why hybrid warfare is more likely. The problem is, if the West goes down that road, we just have this intensification of what we've had with the regime change wars following 9/11. We have this intensification and more pressure being brought to bear. Then at what point does it actually trigger a military response from China? I mean, who knows? This is what I've been saying for many years. We're at a point of transition in the balance of power in the international system, and we can either try and manage that peacefully and in a way which deals with the big problems facing humankind and which also encourages dialogue between states, or we can just go through this transition having one huge struggle and fight. And at the moment, we're going for the struggle and fight approach, which is potentially terribly destructive and terribly worrying. So I think it's more likely a hybrid warfare. This is what we're seeing is intensification of that, as opposed to all-out military conflict. Principally because I don't think the Western military planners probably know that they can't win that kind of war. These kind of strategies of destabilization, sanctions, exploitation of the coronavirus panic, doubling down the pressure on Iran and on Syria, countries which are sort of in a sense more exposed to a health crisis. However severe that health crisis it actually is kind of besides the point. But it can be used as an opportunity to double down on countries. And I mean, I think Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal and Grayzone were reporting on Venezuela and South America and so on, and the US government orientating itself or doubling down on those countries, forming some alliance with Brazil. This is just in the last 24 hours. So I think that's the kind of thing that we've got to be very, very wary of and try to keep our eye on as the corona issue sort of rolls on.
I guess one of my last questions on the corona 9/11 before we just ask you about Syria and the OPCW is, we're thinking a little bit outside the box. We had evidence going back looking at 9/11 that, there was foreknowledge of 9/11. We had insider training before the events and the Project for a New American Century report from 2000 that called for a new Pearl Harbor and things like this. And I mean, we're just probing here, do you think that regarding the coronavirus, we had the Event 201 in October of 2019 where they ran a war game on the coronavirus pandemic. And then a few months later, it actually happens. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, on the issue of 9/11, I'm happy to say that it's, the question from a kind of a mainstream academic point of view is, what was the level of state involvement and which states were involved in it? And I think that's pretty obvious now that the official story is incorrect. Now the question is who was involved in it and who was involved in influencing, arranging, etc., and from which states, okay, including from within the US political system. And, if that's the case with 9/11, then it's perfectly possible that, there are actors at play in relation to this. I mean, some people have talked about bioweapons and so on. All of that is possible. After 9/11, you had the anthrax scares, of course, which Graham McQueen wrote about or researched and wrote about. The anthrax scares at the time, they always presented, this is some kind of Al-Qaeda, Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. As it transpired, the anthrax came from a US laboratory, and it was released by a US scientist who, I think, committed suicide prior to his trial. And so this issue of bioweapons and so on, that's something which needs to be considered in all of this. There are so many sort of things that people got to keep their eye on in all of this. But it's not an unreasonable question, and it's not an unreasonable question to think through the possibility of any number of actors being nefariously involved in this. Beyond sort of the idea of government's going to exploit this, it's possible that it would be. This is one of the sad, realities. I think when the OPCW was formed, and the Chemical Weapons Convention, that you haven't got something really equivalent for biological weapons, or then the US has been building facilities and so on. I think this is one of the things which we need to keep our eye on through all of this. The fact that, especially if we're in a hybrid warfare situation, are there actors who might be sort of using technologies in order to modify viruses and so on, and use them in a strategic way? It's a possibility. I wouldn't rule it out, especially given the concerns that we now have in relation to 9/11. We live in a world where people do dark deeds.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, on this podcast, on January 29th, we were the first to conduct the interview with the bioweapon expert, Francis Boyle, who wrote the Biological Weapons Convention in 1989, who came out saying he thinks, COVID is a bioweapon. And, then our interview went out to spur countless other interviews. But YouTube deleted. We had over 300,000 views on YouTube alone of that interview. And a week ago, YouTube deleted it. And so I've got people emailing me, where can I find that interview? And it's been reposted. So yeah, it's kind of questionable, why do they delete this information if it's, just conspiracy theory? And just on that final, I wanted to ask, how do you deal with walking that line between being seen as a credible academic and the attempts to discredit you by calling you a conspiracy theorist for just asking legitimate questions?
Well, look, these days, anybody who asks serious probing questions of the power structures that they live within are called conspiracy theorists. Everyone. I mean, so even if it's the mildest conspiracies, for example, British government involvement in torture of some Libyan dissident. I remember Jack Straw saying, "Oh, that's just conspiracy theory," until it was proven. Sort of anyone questioning power gets that label is used against them. I tend to, in terms of walking the line, I think you just have to try to remain objective and balanced. And if people want to call you names, then they can call you names. You just have to ignore it. Some people do buy into that and don't really understand that the term conspiracy theorist doesn't actually make an awful lot of sense in the sense it's intended to mean that, it's just crazy ideas, whereas in fact, conspiracies obviously happen. It's a legal term. We send people to jail for conspiring, etc. So you just have to battle through that. But my feeling is in the West that there are a lot of people who are aware of these problems, and there are a lot of people who are aware that there is a lot of corruption in the West and political corruption, and that we need people to be speaking out about it, and don't get they're not swayed by the conspiracy theorist smear. And I see, you see it time and time again, whether it's Peter Hitchens or it's anybody else who questions power. I mean, Bob Parry from Consortium set up Consortium News. He was involved with revealing the Iran-Contra scandal. They're all called conspiracy theorists. It's just, I think it doesn't have the currency that it used to. But also, I think if you're in this situation in the world that we're living in today, especially in the West, if you're not being attacked, then you're probably not doing your job. And that, this is in a sense, this is kind of the price you have to pay for speaking truth in an environment where there's a lot of corruption. You'll get abused, and et cetera, et cetera. But these things are becoming very obvious, I think, to a lot of people. So I don't worry too much about it. You just have to brush it off and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that same approach, and conspiracy theory, the term, and it's kind of like what you said. I'm not conspiracy theorizing. I did an interview with my students when I was an adjunct professor. When I started this podcast with Lance DeHaven Smith, who's a professor emeritus, who wrote the book explaining, using declassified documents, how the CIA basically and the mainstream media in the 1960s and 70s popularized this term conspiracy theory as a weapon to discredit critics. And so again, my approach is very academic. I did an interview with the expert who explains the origins of this term conspiracy theory. So if you have any final thoughts there, and then we can move on to you telling us what's happening with the OPCW and the war in Syria, because, I think it's now 4 whistleblowers who have come out from the OPCW, and basically it's kind of, I guess, been discredited as a neutral institution. So, what's happening there?
Well, obviously, everyone's being knocked a bit sideways by the corona issue, and also, of course, thinking about more broadly what that might mean. But before this kicked off, the OPCW issue had reached a point where there were at least 4 effectively whistleblowers. 2 further statements or emails were published, which showed that there was concerned dissent within the organization. But more importantly, as of January, February, it was January when Ian Henderson addressed the UN Security Council at the Uriah Formula meeting. And what was, so he communicated his criticisms of the OPCW investigation of the alleged chemical attack in Douma in Syria in 2018. But of course, we've had this massive leaks going on for many months. And certainly from our work, looking at this as academics and the working group, we have enough information now to piece together exactly what happened. And exactly what happened with the Douma investigation was that the Douma team deployed, they came back, they wrote an interim report. They were very skeptical that there had been any attack at all. That was in their report. That was then redacted without their knowledge, and then there was argument. And then really all the OPCW inspectors who went to Douma were sort of really muscled out, forced out of the investigation process, and they handed it to somebody else and then produced a final report, which is demonstrably fraudulent. So the final OPCW report, it obfuscated the advice from 4 NATO toxicologists saying that the people had not been killed from chlorine. Okay, it obfuscated that. And of course, as we know, it famously, they blocked the inclusion of Ian Henderson's engineering report, which said that the cylinders were probably hand-placed. And so, we have all this massive evidence now, which is sitting there. We're involved in further work, which will pull together material which I can't talk about at the moment. But I think at the moment, because the final OPCW report is clearly fraudulent in scientific terms, and there are these two issues over the toxicology and the ballistics, I think the efforts now are focused on getting some proper scientific review of the toxicology and the ballistics, and that should probably seal it. That you can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that an attack didn't happen, that the OPCW report was fraudulent. So that's where we are. But as I say, it's all displaced somewhat by for everyone. Everyone's being displaced by corona. But that work's ongoing. But of course, where it will take us to, I think, ultimately, certainly in terms of our own research and writing up, is that you have, as you've had with 9/11 and the war on terror, and as you had with Iraq and WMD, and as is possibly the case with exploitation of corona, you have a lot of propaganda and distortion of reality for political purposes. And I think that the big story on Syria and alleged chemical weapons attacks will be like an Iraq 2.0. But also a very serious one, because it does link into what we were talking about before. The concern here is especially the OPCW being able to be used and manipulated in order to create fraudulent reports, essentially. It becomes a trigger mechanism for war. It becomes a trigger mechanism for war against Iran or Russia, for example. So it's very important. It's very dangerous. And it's part of, I think, this broader problem that we have of the Western Empire, the way it has got itself able to manipulate international organizations which should be independent, and has become a tool for war, in a sense, wars which the West have been driving for a long time. That's the big story from it. But, I'd say we have a debriefing note which the working group published recently. Paul McKee gave a talk at the Harvard Sussex program on chemical and biological weapons. We gave a talk at the House of Commons meeting. I think the evidence is pretty much home and dry now as to what happened, and it was a manipulation, it was a deception that was going on in relation to Duma. And that points, I think, to a broader deception in the case of Syria. So that's where we are with it. We'll certainly keep pushing that forward in the context of all of this chaos we seem to have going on around us. Because, life, even if corona is a real thing, which has to be managed, life is carrying on in other realms and so on. So we'll keep pushing forward with that. But so that's where we are with it.
And I think the OPCW, what happened with that, the fabrication of this chemical false flag attack. I mean, it's a perfect example for corona, again, because we had in this war on Syria, I guess, this independent institution, credible, authority, international institution, national governments lied to us. And the same is happening now with corona. If they did it with OPCW and in Syria and the media as well, they lied to us. What are they not telling us about now, or what are they fabricating now with the coronavirus?
Absolutely. So a lot can be learned for anyone who's sort of thinking about corona. Sort of go and read the material that my working group has put out, and other people have put out. Journalists such as Peter Hitchens, Aaron Matei, and Max Blumenthal Grayzone have been publishing some of the leaks, and WikiLeaks as well, and use that to understand how organizations which should be independent can become manipulated, how scientists can be suppressed and manipulated. And, the more we understand about that, the more equipped we are to not necessarily distrust everything we're told, but it gives us the tools to actually evaluate more carefully and more fully what we're being told, not to be dangerously trusting of organizations and of power. This is why we brought in, this is why democracy evolved, is because you cannot trust power and organizations, and democracy is all about people getting equipped with knowledge and then challenging and scrutinizing their governments, defending their freedoms. It's a basic principle in democracy. And in short, that the whole OPCW saga can tell you a lot about manipulation and propaganda and deception. And it's a good learning process, I think, and people can apply it and equip themselves with that knowledge, and to think more carefully about what they're being told. As Iraq, WMD, and 9/11 are all other, key examples from the recent contemporary history where people, if they read and understand and absorb material, it gives them, in a sense, better capability, sort of intellectual self-defense against propaganda and deception and manipulation, because boy, are we at risk of that at the moment with this fear of the virus gripping so many minds. Very malleable public. I used that phrase in the article. I wasn't able to dig out what I was thinking of, but that was, I think, a press briefer for the Bush administration after 9/11, talking about this is a very malleable moment. This is a teachable moment for the American public, and so on. And that was at the time. So, we do not want to be malleable. We want to be challenged. We're being told, again, not to disbelieve everything. More important than it's ever been. And it's a critical moment for the West, I believe. It's a critical moment for the history of Western democracy and for the West. So I think there's a struggle ahead, but
and my final
keeping forward.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my final question then, if there's anything else that I haven't asked on Corona, 9/11, or Syria that you think is important to bring up, or your final thoughts to leave us with as we all live in real time, the global 9/11, the coronavirus edition. Any final thoughts for us?
Well, it's very important that people support each other in this situation, and it's very important that people who do have some knowledge and some awareness, work to both speak out and challenge, and to think through what's happening. People have to try to stay, if they can, unified, and certainly people who have raised critical questions need to support each other. But it's very important that happens. For a long time, and throughout most of my professional career, we've been involved in wars, and I've gone through the academy, and I've seen time after time a real failure of academics, for example, to really question what's going on and to stand up, even when terrible things happen, even on torture and so on. And, I think for people who, sort of intellectual leaders or academics, there is a real responsibility now to be informed and to if you doubt what's going on, to stand up and be counted in terms of challenging what's going on. I think people do have power. I think people around the world have power, but it's very important that people use their own intelligence, use their own intuition, get informed, read around, and then act, and then stand up if necessary and say, well, I don't agree with that. Whether that's in personal, discussing with family, or whether it's if they're in a different setting and they can challenge what's going on. That kind of willingness to not simply be led is very important at this point in time, because we are in, I think we are in a very, and I'm generally a very cautious person, and so I think we're in a deeply worrying situation now. And people really do need to get informed and to speak up and to use their own intellect. We could be going into very, very dark times if that doesn't occur. So now it's now or never, I guess. And so on. And people such as yourself and others. There's lots of people doing this.
And that. Mm-hmm.
Try to move forward with this, or however dark it gets.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think I think what we're witnessing happens once in a century. This is like World War I, World War II era. What's happening, and it's frightening. And I also think more people need to speak up and to stand up regardless of the consequences. That's what we need. We need this critical mass and people speaking out and stop being afraid, because in the end, who knows how far this can go. And I know I'll post all of your links. You're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you have a few websites, which it's a great resource, a great information. So is there anywhere you'd like to mention, anything else to mention, like where people can follow you, your work?
We'll put those links up. I mean, I think that on my WordPress site, which is on the first page, it does have the working group links as well. So you might put those up anyway. But there's the Syria working group, there's the War on Terror working group now, and then the Organisation for Propaganda Studies. Those are, and then Twitter and Facebook. Those are all on that page. But yeah. Those are the main ones for people to look at if they want to follow up on some of this. Yeah.
Okay, and Dr. Robinson, thanks for your brave work. We hope you keep doing what you're doing. You also, inspired other people to follow your lead. Questioning the status quo, and these are truly historic times. So again, thanks for the interview.
Well, thanks very much, and you keep up the good work as well.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.